The Lever. Subscriber-supported journalism that holds power accountable. As a Lever Premium subscriber, you'll get to hear exclusive bonus content from this episode and others in your feed. To become a subscriber, go to levernews.com.
From the Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm David Sirota. Inflation is one of pundits' favorite words. For years, we were deluged with media hot takes insisting that it was rising workers' wages or too much government spending that was forcing up the cost of goods. But rarely did anyone in the elite media chattering class ever consider that it wasn't workers or public programs that were the culprit. In fact, the real target of their ire should have been the corporations themselves who control the pricing. But don't take it from me. That's what the CEOs of major corporations have literally told their shareholders, that inflation has been good and in fact has given them cover to raise prices on unexpecting consumers. And it's not just the CEOs who are saying it. In a new study by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, researchers found that prices grew faster than labor costs. So no, workers and their wages are not to blame for inflation. Corporations are. But the story goes even deeper than that. Corporate profiteering isn't just what's keeping prices high right now. That profiteering is behind what kicked off the inflation crisis to begin with. Today on Lever Time, we're going to go to senior podcast producer Arjun Singh. He'll first take a look at just how far corporations went to price gouge consumers recently. Then he sits down with New York Times reporter Peter Goodman to understand how this crisis really began, with a broken supply chain that was controlled by 3 mega corporations. That's right now on Lever Time.
In 2021, the leaders of the Kroger Company, the largest supermarket operator in the United States, had a conference call with their shareholders.
Thank you for joining us today. While the COVID-19 health crisis has not ended, this is the first quarter where we saw significant signs of recovery and the beginning of a return to what we are hopeful will be a new normal.
This is the voice of Rodney McMullen, the CEO of Kroger. In that summer, he was feeling pretty optimistic about the state of the company. According to McMullen, profits were strong. They had weathered a supply chain crisis, and more shoppers were trickling back to their stores in person. Then, someone brought up inflation.
Hey, thanks, guys. Can you maybe just give us an update on what you're seeing on the inflation front, and maybe more importantly, just how you feel about your ability to pass through higher prices relative to historical periods? Thanks.
This was in June of 2021, before inflation would reach historic highs and become deeply embedded in the public psyche. At that time, though, McMullen wasn't really that worried.
As you know, if you look at over the years, Kroger has been able to successfully operate in high inflationary environments and low inflationary environments. If you look at the details of inflation during the quarter, if you look in the fresh departments, inflation has continued to increase during the quarter. Part of that is driven because of, if you look at a lot of supply disruptions a year ago because of COVID.
His plan was to just raise prices and then have consumers make up that extra cost. And that's a pretty normal part of doing business, as frustrating as it might be for a consumer. But it was what McMullen said next that was a little bit surprising.
We view a little bit of inflation as always good in our business, and we would expect to be able to pass that through as well on things that are permanent in nature.
At this point, I'm sure many of you listening are familiar with inflation, the rise of prices for goods and services. A year after Kroger's CEO had this call, inflation was at a historic high. In June of 2022, prices had risen 9.1% from the previous year. And it was something a lot of people were beginning to notice.
It's broad-based. I mean, you're talking about food, gas, shelter. Some of these fuel categories are just almost off the charts here. You look at the trajectory, it doesn't feel like there's very much peaking. Remember
People fixated on the rise in workers' wages as the reason for inflation. And the logic went that workers had gained too many wage increases since 2021, and it was overheating the economy.
We don't have enough people to fill our current jobs. And this argument, there are going to be jobs at higher wages are one of the contributing factors to inflation.
But now that the dust is starting to settle on the inflationary surge of the past few years, fresh research and reporting is starting to pinpoint another reason prices shot up so fast. Corporate greed.
Inflation provided a lot of cover for them to go bigger on prices. The consumer thought that this was a phenomenon that they were responding to, and not just initially profiteering or greed, whatever you want to call it. But the evidence now, as we look back on this period of high inflation, is really considerable that profiteering played a sizable role in the high prices that Americans suffered through over this period.
Lindsay Owens is the executive director of the Groundwork Collaborative, a think tank that initially surfaced McMullen's comments about inflation. One thing they found is McMullen isn't unique. Across a lot of sectors, but particularly in the food industry, corporations took advantage of the moment to price gouge customers.
Companies have told us that this is what they are doing. This is one of those things which is like really frustrating as someone who talks about this a lot and gets like a lot of tough questions about the data. And, you know, it's sort of rare that you have a smoking gun, but we have a smoking gun here, right? When we look at the earnings calls over this period of high inflation, CEOs, CTOs, CMOs, all of the big boys, they're mostly boys, all of the chief executive officers at these companies have let us know that they were able to pass along their rising costs and go for more. They told their investors this on earnings calls. They told analysts this on earnings calls. And they talked about it because it was fundamental to the profit margins and quarterly profits that they were turning around and that they expected to keep turning around. And they were letting their investors know how they were bringing in these record profits.
It's true that most companies did have to confront rising costs in the period after the peak of the pandemic. But what stood out to Lindsay and the folks at the Groundwork Collaborative is that profits were far outpacing these costs. And the math didn't really seem to add up, unless these companies were raising prices simply so that they could charge more.
I think it is important for us to understand that the CEOs were telling the truth when they said that they were raising their prices beyond what they needed to cover their rising costs. By the end of 2023, the last quarter of 2023, corporate profits hit their all-time record high. Not a post-pandemic record high, an all-time record high. How are they doing that if rising costs are eating into their bottom line? Well, they're passing along their rising costs, but then going for more, right? But more important than just corporate profits, although that's an interesting piece of data, but your profits could go up just because you're selling more stuff, right? You sell more glasses of lemonade at the lemonade stand, your profits go up. That doesn't necessarily mean you're making more per glass of lemonade. The piece of evidence that we have that suggests that companies were making more per glass of lemonade is that their profit margins were going up too. And what we saw during this incredible period, post-pandemic period, where there were supply chain issues and rising costs, commodities costs going up, energy costs coming up after the war in Ukraine, is that profit margins were increasing as well. And in 2023, we got to 70-year high profit margins. And so this tells us that they're not just selling more glasses of lemonade, they're selling each glass of lemonade at a higher profit.
One area that was glaringly obvious was in the fast food sector. Fast food prices have steadily been going up for at least a decade. And in general, their price hikes have far outpaced the rate of inflation. Take Subway, once the home of the famous $5 footlong. Not only is that off the menu, but since 2014, they've raised their prices 39%, 8% higher than the rate of inflation in the same period. But the worst culprit has to be McDonald's. In 2014, McDonald's was selling burgers for $1. They even had Donald Trump go out and boast about it.
I don't know how you do it. I put together some really impressive deals. But this thing you've pulled off, it's amazing. A big and tasty for just $1? How do you do it? What's your secret?
10 years later, some of their menu items had more than doubled in prices. And then customers revolted. Losing sales, McDonald's decided to drop back to their old ways, and they started offering a $5 value menu. It looked like customers had finally called McDonald's bluff, and they said the prices were just nonsensical. Here's Lindsay Owens again.
That's exactly what happened. And the McDonald's CEO has basically said as much in his earnings calls, where he's basically told investors, he didn't use this exact phrasing, but that they finally broke us, right? And, they got to the breaking point. They were starting to see some fall off of volume. During this period, we had what's called price over volume, where they weren't that worried about how many folks they were bringing in the door because they were able to charge so much for each person who came in the door. They were focused on price. And part of the reason that you do that is because sticking with those higher price points is nice because hopefully you can continue to stick with them over time, right? You don't want to give any of your pricing back, to use the kind of Wall Street jargon. But the McDonald's CEO and other fast food CEOs, and by the way, folks like Walmart and Target, who tend to be discounters and do see a lot of lower income consumers, have all basically started to acknowledge that they've really gotten to the breaking point with the low end consumer.
That cohort decrease in the most recent quarter. Particularly, I think as eating at home has become more affordable, there's been much less pricing that's been taken more recently on packaged food. So you're seeing that eating at home is becoming more affordable. That I think is putting some pressure from a IEO standpoint on that low-income consumer.
If the price hikes weren't bad enough, other fast food places like Wendy's were toying with the idea of using dynamic pricing, a nice-sounding term for what should really be called price gouging. Their idea was to use digital boards to alter prices based on the time of day or the weather or the popularity of a certain item. For the customer, that could have just amounted to a higher price because it was raining or because they had the bad luck of having the same lunch break as everyone else.
The motive is as old as capitalism itself. Companies are trying to make a buck. That isn't new. That didn't change in the pandemic period. The means is the market power that these companies have amassed over decades. And what that market power translates into is pricing power. You don't have to worry about the guy over your shoulder undercutting you if there's no one left over your shoulder because you've gobbled up all the competition. And across every sector of our economy, companies have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger and more and more and more concentrated. And that means is a key feature of what we see right now. But even means was not enough, right? These companies have been getting bigger for decades. We haven't seen this type of pricing rolled out really until this post-pandemic period. And that's because we finally had the final piece of the trifecta, which is the opportunity. Inflation itself really provided the cover that companies needed to roll out some of these most mercenary pricing strategies.
Corporate consolidation isn't necessarily unique to our moment right now, but as Lindsay said, there was a perfect storm brewing these last couple of years. And that began back in the peak of the pandemic, when people were running out of toilet paper, hand sanitizer, exercise bikes, and almost every good you could think of. So after the break, we're going to hear from veteran New York Times journalist Peter Goodman about what he learned when he set out to find out how the supply chain broke down and kicked off a global economic crisis.
So I was already writing a lot about the supply chain, but I really wanted to follow one container, these sort of workhorses of the global supply chain, one container from a factory town in China across the Pacific, and then look at all the industries that touched it as it progressed across the U.S.
Peter Goodman's a New York Times reporter and the author of the book, How the World Ran Out of Everything, Inside the Global Supply Chain. I sat down with Peter to discuss one of the roots of this inflationary period, the supply chain crisis. You may remember back in 2020, there were shortages of a lot of things, And one reason was because the pandemic had disrupted the world's supply chain.
So I met this guy, Hagen Walker, who's the founder of a company based in Mississippi called Glow. He's an interesting guy. He's a tinkerer by nature, who, had an internship at Tesla, turned down a full-time job there because he wanted to go back to his college town of Starkville, Mississippi, where he started this company that makes these novelty plastic cubes that light up when you drop them in water. And then somebody figured out that beyond, the obvious application that like you could stick this in a cocktail and the bartender could look down the bar and figure out when it was time to refill glasses because the light would go out. Turned out that this was useful to kids who had autism. Parents found that bath time was a nightmare. And once they dropped in this glow cube, kids were really soothed. And this turned into a deal that Hagen Walker got to make Elmo-themed bath toys for Sesame Street. And I followed the most important shipment in the life of Hagen Walker's company. He had placed this order for the first batch of these Elmo toys with his factory in Ningbo, China. And then every conceivable difficult thing we now associate with the great supply chain disruption hit. And so by following the path of that container, I came to understand all of the forces that were making the supply chain that we count on extremely vulnerable.
Yeah. And, this might sound like a pretty simplistic question, but what is the supply chain? It's a term that I hear all the time, and it kind of gives this impression that there's like a global assembly line and everything's very neat and order. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. So, when we talk about how does something get from point A to point B, the big supply chain, what exactly are we talking about?
Oh, no, that's a great question. And I'm glad you asked it because, contrary to what we might imagine when we hear global supply chain, as if like some wizards went to the top of a mountain and conjured, an efficient way to make stuff and deliver it to our doors. This is very much an ad hoc system that is built up over decades. It's a bunch of systems, really. It's a bunch of different transportation systems that work together, that overlap, that sometimes collide. Some parts are regulated, some parts are not regulated. For Americans, some of this is tied up in domestic policy and domestic transportation, but then it turns out we're largely dependent upon this international cartel of shipping companies, none of which are American companies, and really excessive deregulation has put us at the mercy of three alliances that dominate traffic across the Pacific Ocean. They control something like 95% of that trade. So the supply chain essentially means, how do we make things? How do we get things to where they're supposed to go? And there's a lot of complexity in that simple little phrase.
Eventually, we get to the point where you have these non-American alliances kind of controlling 95% of our supply chain. What would you say was the transition moment for the global economy to get into the hands of this? Because I think at this point, many developed nations like the United States are heavily reliant on this kind of globalized supply system right now.
Yeah, for sure. It's a story that's steeped in deregulation. If you go back decades, we had antitrust exemptions for shipping companies that served the states so that they could coordinate their schedules, so that they could coordinate prices in some cases, which we thought was okay, provided that some government regulator was making sure that every place that needed to be served was served. And then there were price caps, and there was transparency in pricing. And then we had two landmarks, one in the 80s, and then one in the 90s, where we essentially kept the antitrust exemption, but we allowed companies to start negotiating deals in secret. So, previously it's like, if you were shipping one container from anywhere to somewhere in the States, you got the same tariff that was quoted, to any company. But this was an open invitation for, obviously Walmart, Amazon, Target, to get sweetheart deals. And so we kind of optimized the supply chain for them, and their investor interests. And if you wanted to make stuff at scale and drive down the price, this was a pretty good deal in many instances, but it drove a lot of competition out. And then in terms of the shipping question, you had a bunch of things happen. First of all, all, container shipping became the standard. So, I tell the story of how before 1950, shipping was slow. It was extremely dangerous. It was unreliable. Loading and unloading a ship tended to take days and days. And it was, there was no template. It's like, human beings had to go down into the hull and figure out, I'm going to stick this side of cattle here, this drum of paint there, casks of liquor over here, and fit it all together like this crazy jigsaw puzzle. There were a lot of accidents. There was a lot of corruption. There was a lot of waste. And along comes the shipping container, the standard size box where you can pack stuff into the box at the factory. You can move this stuff around from rail to truck onto ship, using standardized equipment. So that dropped the price of shipping dramatically. Then you have China enter the WTO. I'm kind of, shotgunning some of this stuff, but you get China into the WTO, you get the capacity to move stuff around very quickly. You get mass assembly. Going all the way back to Henry Ford. And so that's a prescription for supply chains to jump oceans. And then back to your question about shipping, you get governments in South Korea, Taiwan, China, subsidizing ocean carriers as a way to boost their exports, and no one else can compete. Competitors are driven out of business. You combine that with deregulation, and here we are, where you have a handful of giant shipping companies that dominate the trade.
Wow, that's interesting, because it seems sort of like a parallel to what happened with microchips, where you saw a lot of Asian countries like South Korea, they were investing in microchips, which actually also kind of became part of the supply chain crisis we saw. So, Peter, what happened? I remember being back during that period, the peak of the pandemic, even a little bit after, you're seeing pictures and videos of the whole containers just sitting at the dock. There's issues going on with truck drivers, but I feel like I never actually got a sense of what really was happening that disrupted the supply chain so badly. And what did you discover in your reporting?
Well, there's a lot packed into this question. First of all, it's important to note that there's a lot of monopoly power in this supply chain. So there's what I call engineered scarcity, where, it is not a coincidence that every time there's some disruption to the system, consumer goods go up.
Right.
We suddenly can't get really important things, whether we're talking about computer chips, medical devices, ventilators, more frivolous things like bath toys, which, we can obviously live without, infant formula, toilet paper. At the end of every one of my chapters is this unfunny punchline that then some industry celebrated record profits. And these two things are not coincidental. But what happened, I view the pandemic disruption as much more a reveal of problems that had been there all along and that had popped up previously than the cause. But the direct cause of the shortages that I'm writing about during the worst of the pandemic was that forecasts were wildly off about how the economic consequences of the pandemic would play out. So economists, people running big companies said, well, okay, we've seen this movie before. People are going to be confined to their homes. We hadn't seen that part, but we'd seen what was assumed to be a plunge in demand. People were going to lose their jobs. That would take spending power out of the economy. Factories would be disrupted, so we wouldn't have as much stuff to make, which meant we wouldn't have as much need for container ships, for rail cars, for workers. And so lots of companies cut orders. I'm sure we'll get to this, but it's worth noting that for decades, large companies have been governed by this mantra, just in time. Let's not, build excess inventory. We can come back to the permutations of that later, but basically, anybody in control of factory operations assumed they'd need less stuff. And then what happened was, while we didn't go to the gym, we bought exercise bikes and put them in our basements. We didn't go to the office. And so the sandwich place down the street from our office lost a lot of business. But suddenly those of us with children are cooking, 27 meals a day for children cooped up with distance learning. We're outfitting our offices, or our bedrooms into offices. We're trying to entertain children with, trampolines. We're buying barbecues so we can have some semblance of leisure time. And all of these things, or many of these things, are made in factories in Asia. And the container shipping industry was at first overwhelmed. Then the ports themselves were overwhelmed. I mean, my book starts with the mother of all traffic jams, 50 plus container vessels floating off the ports of LA and Long Beach. These two ports are the gateway for 40% of imported products reaching the United States by container ship. And they're swamped in part because there aren't enough truck drivers. Truck drivers are sick. We've downgraded trucking to the point where lots of people are leaving. Dock workers are sick. The warehouses are low staffed and people are falling ill there. There's stuff to the rafters with goods. So the whole system just kind of buckles in the face of this tremendous surge of imports.
I'm really glad that you brought up the ports and the truck drivers in particular, because what I really enjoyed about your book is how human centric it is. And at one point you write about the impact of, I think, decades of kind of the degradation of worker empowerment, essentially. And especially for the dock workers and truck drivers, how does labor fit into the story and what we saw happen? What has sort of been the evolution of the humans who go behind the supply chain, whether that's truck drivers or warehouse workers? How does that play a role in what we eventually saw manifest a couple years ago?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, because I think we're so steeped in the notion that the internet, container shipping, if we think about it at all, but globalization has made transportation, production, it's all pretty seamless. We don't agree on very much today, but most of us think that we have faith that if we click on, an Amazon site, within hours, in some cases, some truck will show up at our door, and we're kind of invited to not think about the army of human beings who are behind all of this, working in factories, often on the other side of oceans, working on the docks, maintaining rail. I spent a lot of time with traveling rail crews who were dealing with the indignity of a potential strike over, no paid sick leave. They're away from their families for weeks and months at a time because of just in time. Their jobs have been made very flexible, which is a euphemism for they have no idea when they're coming home. They're missing the births of children, the deaths of relatives. And so when this breaks down, we are forced to realize that we are dependent upon this unseen army of people whose jobs have indeed been downgraded to the point where once there's an alternative to these jobs, I rode for 3 days with a truck driver through the midsection of the U.S. in the middle of winter from Kansas City down to Dallas and back, slept in the cab for a couple of nights. And boy, my takeaway was if you've got another way to make a living, you're going to do it. It's always been a tough job, but back before deregulation, the Teamsters were in charge. The Teamsters are a controversial outfit, but they demonstrate the value of having a union, making sure that workers get a piece of the action. And I'll tell you this. I tell the story of Henry Ford in the book. Henry Ford is obviously a highly problematic character. He smashed organized labor. He was a virulent racist and anti-Semite, but he knew a thing or two about supply chains. And in the 19-teens, he doubled wages for his workers when he was desperately trying to fill out two giant factories engaged in mass assembly. People called him a communist. And he said, I just want to make things and sell my product at a low price and know that I can make my products when I need to. And he specifically said any business that's built on low wage labor is inherently unreliable. And that is something that I hope people will take away from my book.
Yeah. That's an interesting point to kind of end on that part, because now today I feel like we're in this era of Silicon Valley. Everybody's talking about robots and the I guess the word is automation. I wanted to say the word robotification of the economy, but you see that everywhere, from Elon Musk vowing that Tesla is going to automate the whole trucking fleet. And then even inside warehouses, we're going to have these R2-D2 Star Wars style droids moving everywhere. Maybe at one point you went to a trade show, right? And you saw some of these robots. How realistic of a premise is that? And I guess, what is your perspective on the idea that is being sold by a lot of companies, frankly, to gin up investment that says, look, we're just going to be able to replace humans on the supply chain and everywhere else with robots? Will that even actually solve any of the problems that we have? It feels it's like a solution in search of a problem.
I mean, it might be the solution to some problems in that robots don't go on strike. They don't have children to take care of. They don't have to go to the bathroom. I mean, if your idea of utopia at running a business is that you don't ever have to answer to human demands, then the pull to automate is great. And, you don't have to be a Luddite, by the way, to embrace automation. I mean, there is this innovation because for as long as people have been around, we've thought about ways to lessen our burden and to stop doing things that are dangerous and grueling and hand those tasks over to machines. The problem is that we've done a very poor job, especially in this country, of compensating the people whose jobs are on the line. I mean, I remember years ago, I went to this mine in Sweden. And I talked to workers who were threatened by self-driving trucks. And I was really struck by how they all said, yeah, we're fine with it because that could make our company more profitable. And if our company's more profitable, then, our wages will go up. And this was not some idealistic flight of fancy. This was their lived experience. I mean, they live in Sweden where there are high taxes that pay for national health care. So if they lost their job, they wouldn't be without health care, where there are very generous and pretty effective job training programs for people who are affected by trade. So they had every confidence that if they lost their jobs, they'd be trained for another. Whereas American workers and workers in many major economies have every legitimate reason to look at automation as the latest way in which the shareholder class is trying to squeeze them out of the equation so that investors get more, so that margins get fatter, you reduce cost, and they know from their lived experience that, boy, it's a long way down.
Yeah.
If you lose a factory or warehouse job in the United States, you don't have health care necessarily. Maybe your spouse has it. Maybe you can qualify for something like Medicaid. Maybe you can afford to buy a cheap policy on one of these state exchanges. But, you could easily end up in a situation where you'll be lucky to take a job at half of your previous wages. And so that resistance to automation comes from a collective policy failure and really the triumph of the investor class over social good.
A little while ago, we had Austin Frerick on the show to discuss JBS Foods, this big food conglomerate that's based out in Greeley, Colorado. And we talked about the history of how they became a monopoly in their field. And you also talk about JBS in your book, and you include them in there. Tell me a little bit about what you reported on about them and why you brought them in here.
Sure. I'm glad you're asking that question. So JBS Foods is, of course, as you've covered, the product of two convicted felons in Brazil who amassed tens of billions of dollars through fraudulent means and then bought up slaughterhouses around the world, including this plant that I focus on in Greeley, Colorado. They are the largest meat packer in the United States. The four largest meat packers control roughly 85% of the capacity to process beef. That's, a number that would make the robber barons blush. And I was really interested in understanding how monopoly power was generating momentum for this sort of engineered scarcity. And I spent time talking to the daughter of a woman who died at the Greeley slaughterhouse owned by JBS. The woman who died was named Tin Ai. She was an immigrant from Myanmar. She had spent 15 years in a refugee camp in Thailand. She and her daughter arrived in the U.S., speaking no English, knowing no one. She gets a job at the slaughterhouse, and she's happy to make $12 an hour. And as the pandemic begins, her daughter begs her not to go to work. She's hearing that already some people are coming down with symptoms of COVID. This is, of course, long before vaccines. And her mom says, no, I've got to go because I'm not going to be paid if I don't go. She dies. As I'm hearing this story, the daughter is holding her 20-month-old infant son who is looking at a picture of the grandmother that he will never meet. And that story was tragic enough in real time. But what I learned subsequently was that, the Trump administration dropped this executive order to keep slaughterhouses going, and really contravening local public health ordinances, even where local public health authorities said these plants are super spreaders, they must be shut down. Well, the Trump administration took up industry talking points and said, well, if we don't keep these slaughterhouses going, people are going to go hungry in the United States. And what we subsequently learned, and what I reveal in the book, is that at the time that the Trump administration drops this order, the meat packing industry is sitting on record volumes of product in its freezers, and they're boosting their exports, including to China. So Tin Ai, who was one of 5 people who died at that Greeley plant in the first few months of the pandemic, is supposedly died so the rest of us could eat. She really died because we used government authority to make sure that profits got fattened for monopoly entities.
Something that you brought up earlier that I do want to go back to and kind of understand a little bit more is the concept of just in time. What is just in time in terms of the supply chain, and how does it fit into the story that you've been telling me so far?
Yeah, it's a super important question. So just in time was this notion pioneered by Toyota at the end of the Second World War that was very sensible and very successful. Toyota said, well, we're dealing with the devastation of the war. We've got limited capital. Japan has lots of islands, so there isn't that much developable land. We can't just emulate Henry Ford's version of mass assembly where we just crank out as much product as we can manage and figure out how to sell it later. We're just going to make as many cars as we need to replenish the ones that have just been sold. And we're going to look at our supply chain too. We're going to say to our suppliers, just bring us as many parts as we need in real time on the assembly line to keep us going. Well, this idea helps Toyota become, by many measures, the most successful car company, on earth. But I indict McKinsey in the book, but really the whole consulting class is on the line for serving the interests of the investor class. They take this sensible idea about reducing waste and they turn it into this very crude mantra to eliminate inventory. Don't fill your warehouses with parts and products and raw materials as a hedge against the inevitable troubles that pop up. Take the savings and give it to yourselves, corporate CEO, as a reward for being brilliant enough to hire McKinsey. Give it to your investors through share buybacks and dividends. They'll love it. Your share price will go up. And that actually works pretty well for if you're an investor. It does help lower costs for all sorts of consumer goods, but it leaves us vulnerable every time there's a shock to the system. We run out of things. I mean, the first supply chain story I ever wrote was back in 1999 when there was an earthquake in Taiwan that knocked the semiconductor market down. And it plays a very key role in the pandemic disruptions because by the time this hits, inventory is so lean. And by the way, the consultants didn't pay attention to a cardinal rule of the Toyota experience, which was you got to have your suppliers close to your factory. So now you've got factories separated by oceans from their supplier. I mean, Henry Ford, boy, he would have just spun in his grave. I walked the catwalk in early 2022 at Ford's River Rouge plant, which was this kind of monument to self-sufficiency. And, it's early 2022. They're making Ford's F-150 pickup truck. It's their most popular vehicle. It's this kind of very impressive, symphony of production. There are some robots. There's still people. But they're taking the finished vehicles and they're parking them in the shadow of Ford's corporate headquarters and across the street from Henry Ford Elementary School because they've left themselves vulnerable to this computer chip shortage. And until the computer chips show up, these cars are just stuck there. They can't drive.
One thing I'm wondering is, you have the supply chain breaking down, you have all of these problems, but at the same time, is there really an incentive for these companies to get things back in order necessarily? Here on Lever Time at the beginning of the show, we looked at food companies, and food companies seem to have taken advantage of the period of the pandemic or this period of inflation to push up their prices just a little bit more, but the incentives are now kind of disentangled from each other. Is that something that we saw happening with the supply chain too? Was there an incentive for these companies to figure it out and get goods moving, or were they actually benefiting a little bit because they can extort the fact that they were monopolies in these industries?
They were benefiting a lot. I mean, this is a crucial point. So first of all, the shipping carriers were celebrating record profits in 2022.
Yes.
They were making, somewhere around $300 billion as an industry. So here's this vital artery to everything, right? This is how we get medicines and the building blocks for medicines. This is how we get medical devices. This is how we get furniture, clothing. All of this stuff that consumers depend on is coming in, via this industry that has every reason to prolong the crisis. I mean, we don't know where on the supply demand curve they're maximizing their revenues. It's somewhere around, the threat of disruption. So importers and exporters will just pay whatever it costs to make their stuff move without actually dropping the margins. But if you don't have much competition, what incentive do you have to lower your prices? And if you've been liberated from regulations that forced you to disclose your prices so everyone can see them, well, now there's no transparency, and you got the whole world believing that these disruptions have created all this inflation, which happens to be true, but we don't know how much is, a reasonable recouping of extra costs and how much of it is a fattening of margins, which, by the way, is happening again. Because, as we speak, we know that the Houthis are opening fire on container vessels that are headed toward the Suez Canal in solidarity with Palestinians living in Gaza. And as a result of that, you got a lot of container traffic that would normally be going through the Suez Canal from Asia to get to Europe and the East Coast of the United States that instead is going the long way around Africa, which adds, days. There's a lot of extra fuel that has to be burned. Well, the analysis I've seen suggests that should increase the cost of moving a container by about $1,000, but the actual increases are like $3,000 and $4,000. And again, there's no regulation. So this is just money that this international shipping cartel is able to grab for itself because we're dependent upon what they're offering, and there's no competition.
Given everything that we saw take place, is there any kind of a reconsideration in the CEO or the investment class? Because outside of their business interests, I just imagine that there were plenty of investors who had to have been annoyed themselves by the same issues that we were experiencing. Does it seem like there's, at least in that world, the Davos world, if you will, some sort of a reckoning, or at least an open discussion about how we change this?
I think in terms of financialization, there's a lot of lip service, right? You can talk about stakeholder capitalism if you want, but I think I laid this out in my last book, and I think the pandemic pretty much proved that these are press releases and photo ops, and Milton Friedman and his idea about profit maximization is still very much with us. That's the driving force. I do think that the geopolitical considerations are very real, right? So whoever wins the presidential election here in the States in November, if you are managing money or running a business, there is a safe assumption that U.S.-China trade animosity and really the emergence of what feels like a new Cold War is with us for good, and you better plan accordingly. So if you're going to depend solely on China, China's got an unbeatable combination of highly efficient labor that's very cheap. Labor unions are basically banned. You can get around environmental standards by cutting in, the relevant Communist Party officials. That's been very enticing to companies like Walmart, but you can't get around the fact that the Trump tariffs are now the Biden tariffs. They're not going away. We've seen an increase in tariffs. On the grounds of national security combined with the imperatives of industrial policy and the idea that the U.S. has to protect important emerging industries like electric vehicles, we've seen additional tariffs. So that is forcing a thinking about place that wasn't there before. You know, we've all lived through a half century or so where we've been invited to assume that a factory in, you know, southern China might just as well be in southern Ohio. Doesn't matter as long as there's a container ship, as long as there's rail or truck or whatever that can bridge the gaps. Well, it is true for geopolitical reasons that that's changing, and especially in terms of the place of China as a center for global manufacturing. But as I conclude in the book, I think the imperatives of financialization are still very much with us.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. This episode was produced by me, Arjun Singh, with help from Chris Walker and editing support from Lucy Dean Stockton. Our theme music was composed by Nick Campbell.